three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. As you guys know, I'm a motorcycle and car enthusiast, and I'm also an entrepreneur. And I think that this guest combines the two very well. And going to give you some great insight on the automobile industry and what went wrong in the United States. As you guys know, I went on a Route 66 trip this past year. And it's been a dream of mine to do so. I'm a big Mustang guy. I love muscle cars, but the automobile industry is tanking. And our guest, Josh Murray, wrote a book called Wrecked: How the American Automobile Industry Destroyed Its Capacity to Compete. So thank you so much for being here, Josh.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with the genesis of this book. What made you want to write a book about the automobile industry and how it's basically in decline?
I think puzzles interest me. And so it was a puzzle to look around 2008. I'm in graduate school and kind of finishing up my PhD. And that's the economic crash in Ford and General Motors getting bailed out by the taxpayers, where, they might not even exist anymore had we not bailed them out. And so it's this puzzle because you go back to 1960, and this is the most successful, most powerful industry in the richest country in the history of the world. And so it's just, well, what happened? And the existing explanations didn't satisfy me. So I was interested to kind of explore and figure it out.
Well, my initial response is, well, of course, with the United States and the regulation that was implemented, you have unions, you have minimum wage. You just can't compete against other countries who are maybe adopting certain technology faster, but they don't have to play by the same rules. And that's why you see companies in China just smashing the United States when it comes to this. So am I right?
Somewhat, partly. So I think unions are part of the story, and innovation is a huge part of the story. But interestingly, it's not just regulation that has to do with kind of how things are produced and whether that makes it cost prohibitive to implement innovations or whether it makes it easy to implement innovations. And that was the really interesting finding that I had looking at that. So one of the examples because that is one of the big explanations is just, okay, well, there's all these regulations and it's high labor costs in the US. You're competing with countries without that. But Toyota is the really kind of the example of the foreign competitor that's so successful. And they produce the cars here in the US facing the same regulations and using the same workers. So they don't produce the cars in Japan and then ship them over. They move their entire production into the US and then they produce them here. So the question was like, okay, so how do they compete in such a great way in the US?
Wow, I didn't even know that. What made them do that? Toyota is a smaller branch of another major company, though, right? Isn't it?
Well, the way they're set up in Japan is there's ties to all the companies have ties to larger banks, so they're these kind of Keiretsus. But it is its own company, Toyota Motor Company. It's one of the
Got
biggest
it.
things. It really has to do with how they produce the cars. So it's really important for them to have all the suppliers and the assemblers clustered together, and not have to ship things too far because they use just-in-time delivery. And so they don't want to produce things in Japan and then ship them to the US. And so when they produce things in the US, they create these little production centers, and then they make them there. And one of the first ones they did is they actually took over one General Motors used to run in Fremont, California. And it was one of General Motors' least efficient. And they took it over, and within a few years, it was the most efficient. These were these clues of like, okay, so they're doing something different. What is this?
Can you give a quick little background on the automobile industry? I know that in the 50s and 60s it boomed, and it's probably because of they call it the Freedom Highway, right? It's Route 66, people traveling around. They didn't trust airplanes as much. So everybody was buying a car, and that was part of the American dream. And I guess right around talk about stagflation in the 70s and the gas, and then it started to decline, and I guess there was a comeback a little bit. So can you give us a quick little rundown?
Yeah, I'm gonna first start where you started, and then I'm gonna actually back us up to tell
Okay.
a complete story. So yeah, 50s and 60s is the height of the U.S. auto industry. So like 1960 was the start of my puzzle, where it's just like the big three auto companies, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, which of note, there's not even really a Chrysler anymore, right?
Right.
Stellantis. But when you look, they're headquartered in Amsterdam. Their CEO is a Portuguese businessman. Only 32% of their workforce is the US. So it's hard to even call Stellantis an American company. So there's not even a big three anymore. But back then, right, the big three, they had 98% of the US domestic market. So these are just three companies that completely dominate the auto industry. They
Wow.
make, they're headquartered in Detroit. Detroit's the richest city of that size in the world at the time. Flint, which is, a major production area and, famous now for its lead in the drinking water, at the time, the richest small city in the world. And so it's really like, right, the auto industry is just, it is the peak of it. It is very shortly after, by the late 60s, they start to lose a little bit of market share as foreign companies come in. And by the mid 70s, it's just a downward slope, and you could follow it all the way to 2008 when my book went, and really follow it to today for the most part. And it's just a straight, just losing market share to foreign companies. I think they were at 45% when the book was published. I think it's around that. I'd have to look again. Maybe I think it might have gone up a little bit to like 47, but it's not over 50, nowhere near 98.
Well, early 80s, that's when Honda started to make a
Yeah,
big push, right, in the United States?
yeah, yeah. Honda comes in the early 80s. Toyota comes in the late 60s and 70s and starts to get a foothold. So it's really Japanese firms come in and make a big Toyota for a while. I think GM overtook them again and has the most market share, but Toyota for a while had the most market share in the US, and they're still number two. And then you have Volkswagen, and you have some European automakers also come in and take up some market share. Uh, but interestingly, if you kind of back it up before 1950, so 1950 and 1960 is the peak, but in my analysis, it's almost a mask for the problems that were already there. And so if you kind of go back to the beginning in 1910s and follow it to 1950, it's just a growth, right? It's the business is booming, and it's incredibly innovative. So just innovative in product, innovative in process, just always changing how they make things, getting higher quality. And competition is really in terms of innovation, right? So GM and Ford are battling and going back and forth, taking over the number one spot, and it's coming up with new ways to do things and making it more efficient. And the 50s and 60s, the competition becomes more about advertising and style. It's not, the innovation really slows down. And in some ways, the auto industry in the 50s and 60s creates kind of Madison Avenue. It creates the advertising industry because they're the ones that really start using it. And the quick drop off in the 70s and beyond is the foreign companies come in and they're still innovating. And so it's like the US companies, they didn't have any competition, and all three of them weren't innovating. And so they were just, putting stripes on the side of something and trying to advertise it to you. And they could dominate for a while with no competition. But once competition came in that was innovative, they quickly lost ground. And so part of the puzzle for me then was, well, why did they stop innovating? What happened? Why are the other companies more innovative, and trying to figure that out?
Gotcha. And so the writing was on the wall, and they were set to decline regardless because of all they got comfortable, basically, right? And so what happens then in the 70s? I think what I realized is that, you go back to the 70s, gas prices, people didn't drive as much, but they were creating these gas guzzlers. And I guess maybe that's whenever people started to become way more cost effective. And so they started looking outside of the typical three and finding fuel efficient vehicles, which opened up the market. Is that right for the Japanese?
Absolutely right. So we had a change in the environment, and people wanted fuel efficient cars, and the Japanese were producing them, and Europeans were producing them also, and the U.S. firms tried to switch over, and they couldn't produce them at the same efficient rate, and so they had these gas guzzlers. And so that was part of the puzzle. Is it wasn't that they didn't know about producing small fuel efficient cars. It was that the innovations needed to produce them were too cost effective, not cost effective, too cost prohibitive to implement. And there were these studies by these Harvard economists in the 70s already trying to explain this, like what happened with innovation. And there's these case studies, and they talk about things like disc brake, And in each one, they've discovered the innovation long before they implement it. They know what to do, but it's really expensive to implement because of the ways they produce things. And so it's almost like with innovation, there's the idea of the tipping point, right? So you have the early innovators, and then people start to adopt it, but many don't adopt it until you hit a tipping point where it becomes you can't compete without, right? And so it was so expensive to implement the innovations that the big three would hold off on implementing the innovation until they couldn't anymore because their competitors were doing it and they were taking all of their business. And then they would finally implement, and that just put them behind all the time. And that is the big part of the decline, which isn't my that's not my kind of I didn't discover that. That's other analysts had found that part. The part that I add to it is kind of figuring out why that's the case. I think the existing idea was that labor costs made it hard to implement innovations, and just the culture of management that they got comfortable and wanted to play it safe. And what I found looking at the old innovative industry, right? So that kind of 1910s to 1950 era where they're really innovative, really before 1950, before World War II, is that the way they produce cars is features all the same ways that the Japanese produce cars. And the Japanese, Toyota's leader actually visited Ford in 1950 and saw it and said, "This is great. I'm going to bring it to Japan and perfect it." And
Wow.
so the different ways of producing it, it comes from the U.S. and the way that they produce actually helps innovation. It helps you create innovation. It helps you implement it. And so the book kind of goes through all these kind of features of the production system that allowed it. And so once that changed, it wasn't. My argument isn't that management started not valuing innovation. It's almost like you adjust your culture to structural reality. So when innovation is too expensive, you start to not really value innovation, right? When innovation is not expensive, that's what you compete on. And so what happened is they changed the way they produce. And that, you mentioned unions, that's where the union story comes in. Is right before World War II, there's just huge labor conflict. You have the Flint sit down strike, and you have rapid unionization in the industry. And there's all this talk among management of the union doesn't just want better contracts. They start to want to co-manage. They want to have a say in what's produced and where it's produced. And they have a lot of power. They have a lot of leverage. And part of that comes from the way they produce. So I mentioned the Japanese firms, they want everything concentrated. And they also use this just-in-time delivery, right? And so they'll have kind of one supplier make all the parts for all these cars, and it's right next door. So it becomes really easy to get a couple hundred people sit down and shut down all of production. And so workers had a huge amount of power. And the big three automakers kind of decided we need to reduce this or it's going to hurt us. And so they changed the way they produce things. They start carrying more inventory. So if there's a work stoppage, they can just move the inventory. They
Wow.
start spreading production out so that it's harder to coordinate. And I don't know if they knew that it would undermine innovation, right? It's not clear that they knew exactly that the way we have this set up is why we're so innovative. And it makes sense that they just thought, okay, we need to do X, Y, Z to kind of undermine worker power so that they don't take over management. But once that was done, they didn't notice that it hurt innovation because they had no competition. All three of them did it. And so you have a 20-year period where they're, at the peak of their powers. And it's not until the Japanese show up using the old system that they can't compete anymore because the Japanese are just super innovative and they can't, they see the innovations, they can't implement them. They're too expensive.
Makes me think of the movie Gung Ho. Have you ever seen that movie?
No.
Gung Ho with Michael Keaton. And it pretty much highlights exactly what you just said. They come in and they're so efficient, they're so driven, and they just crush the American workforce. And obviously, there's a lot of great things from the American culture that they want to adopt, but they have perfected a system that, like you said, they got from Ford, which is wild. Now, so there is no coming back, right? You're talking about a pretty much an industry that is fallen basically to an automobile industry that's from overseas. Is there any coming back? And it was their own doing that caused all this, right?
Right. So I guess I can answer it two ways. Could you possibly come back? And then do I think it's likely, right? um, Possibly, yes. And I could see two ways. One would be that the Japanese changed their system, maybe COVID, maybe their workers, if they were to change their system and kind of lose that advantage, that would even the playing field. It doesn't seem like that'll happen. I was reading some stories about how Toyota was so successful during COVID and more successful than other companies, and they were chalking it up to the system. And it was interesting to read because they were kind of rediscovering what I had discovered about the system, that it's not just a lot of analysts see it as just in time, and that's all. They don't carry big stockpiles, but it's really about the flexibility of the system. And so that flexibility allows you to change, to innovate. You change how you produce things. You can quickly reorganize it because it's so flexible. And that allowed them to kind of weather the storm during COVID and during having supply chain problems because it was such a flexible system. So I doubt that they're going to undo that. It's worked for them so well. The other option is that the US companies re-implement the system. The reason I don't think it's likely is it takes an immense amount of trust between the workers and the auto companies. If the workers feel like they've been getting screwed over and then you re-implement that and give them all that power, they're immediately going to go on strike and demand so much that it kills you.
Yep.
And if management doesn't trust workers, then they're never going to fully implement it, which is one of the things I go through in the book. You see the US companies put little parts of the system back in place, but they never fully do it. And they always back off of it the minute there's any labor conflict. And so I don't know that you could rebuild that trust. It's one of the things the Japanese firms also have is an immense amount of trust between the management and the workers. And a whole system for taking in complaints from the workers and working them into the system. And it's developed over time, and it makes it so that they can have this system that potentially could be used to go on strike and demand, huge raises and an amount of money that maybe would undermine their competitiveness. And the workers don't necessarily do that. And part of it is they trust that if Toyota's making a bunch of money off of innovation, they'll see some gains from that. And so it's worth it for them. And in the US, we just saw a major strike. The thing that's developed is no trust. That the workers think that if GM or Ford make a bunch of money, they'll keep it, and they can only get it if they demand it through strikes. And GM and Ford think that if they give in at all, the UAW is gonna take advantage of them. And so that lack of trust really undermines the what's needed to re-implement this system that allows for innovation.
Yeah, I guess the UAW, for everything that they stand for and who they really are trying to protect, it seems like their politics are just way out of whack. Like, it doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So do you see them making really poor decisions, especially over the past couple of years?
Yeah, especially I think if you go from probably the 70s up to recently, pretty poor decisions. So one of the things that the UAW did for a while, and it's changing, and so we'll see what happens with this new leadership. At least from the workers' perspective, they won the last strike, so that's good for them. Now, whether they translate that into good decisions that are good for the industry as a whole and for them remains to be seen. But before, what ended up happening is I think they kind of recognized, at least subconsciously, they had less leverage once the production system changed. Mm-hmm. And so they went to kind of really narrow demands rather than thinking about just kind of demanding wages and nothing else. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is if you look at the wages of auto workers now and compare them in the past, they haven't fallen. They've gone up. They've done a great job with that. But the amount of workers that GM employs in the United States has plummeted. So there's a part if you're supposed to represent the working class, are you really doing good if you keep me at $20 an hour, but we go from 300,000 employees to 50,000?
Yep.
The working class as a whole has been hurt by that. And so a lot of the decisions made by the UAW kind of through the years, I think, contributed to that. Now, it seems that the new leadership at least understands leverage. So they kind of recreated the old leverage they had by not forecasting that they were going on strike and picking key plants that were important in the production system. Now, if they understand that leverage, maybe they could translate that into understanding that leverage toward innovation and understanding that an innovative industry that grows is better for workers as a whole, right? And that would be something. Now, will they do that? I don't know, right? So there's some hope in that they seem to understand leverage better than past union leaders did, understand the system as a whole and how it works, but I don't know if they will use that toward working with the companies to one of the things that happened in the past is the companies would innovate and the workers got higher wages at the end of innovation, right? That the companies would make more money and the workers would get more money, and a growing industry is better for the workers than a stagnant industry. And whether they'll see that and use the kind of power that they seem to have to not just win strikes for wages, but also help the industry. Maybe, if you went into the auto companies and said, look, we need to innovate the system we have. It reduces our leverage, but it also reduces your ability to innovate. We'll sign a contract saying we're not going to strike if you bring, the jobs back here and build the factories and have it concentrated. And, we'll give you a 10-year or a 20-year grace period. So that would go a long way toward probably helping the industry as a whole. But I don't know. We'll see what happens. If they're going to just focus on wages or if they'll focus on larger kind of things like that in the industry.
One thing I posted today was a question about phone numbers. And I believe in 20 years, I think phone numbers are going to be a thing of the past. Now, it also made me think of, because I knew this podcast was popping up, car buying and car ownership, I think is going to be almost a thing of the past. You give it enough time, right? There's studies that show, or data that points to that kids are not buying cars anymore. They're Ubering everywhere. So I'm sure you have some stats and figures that might be shocking, that most people are not buying cars like they once did, and it's not coming back. So what are your thoughts on that? Have you seen anything? This book came out in 2019.
Right.
I'm assuming because of all the changes, even the past 4 or 5 years, that it's quite substantial, that there's new information out. But what have you seen, and what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen that trend that you mentioned. I think that there's probably a lot of generational changes that are going to come and seemingly come quick when the new generation kind of grows into being middle-aged and being the one that are buying everything. And it will seem like we didn't see it coming because we're so focused on the current middle-aged and older people. And the culture is really different, right? With cars, as you point out, they're used to Ubering. So there's long been this American culture of owning your car and the freedom that brings, driving on the highway and seeing that. And if those kids don't have that culture, it's going to be really different. And people, it's not just an economic thing, right? It is also what you grew up doing. And so I'd imagine there'll be a lot of changes in about, 15 years or so that will seem like overnight, like, whoa, look at this dropped off. But you can kind of see it coming now with the different behavior. Also, just the self-driving cars, as that technology actually takes off and works. There's horror stories about it right now, but I think back to when the personal computer first came out and how it would crash all the time. And so, new technology always doesn't work immediately, but give it 10 years and it'll probably be amazing. As things like that take off, there'll be less desire to own your own car, not even driving it. And so you could imagine Ubers that are self-driving. I think that there's definitely changes industry-wide, and those sorts of changes could also shake up what companies, are dominant. Any sort of change like that presents an opportunity for a different company to kind of leapfrog if they're on the ground floor of that change and innovating. Now, will the U.S. companies? I mean, as long as they have this system that makes it hard to innovate, I would imagine no, they'll stay in the back. But every time there's something new, if they were to choose to put this kind of concentrated, flexible system in place, they could absolutely take advantage. So there was, for a little bit with, I'm blanking on the newest technology that they've been working on. The not self-driving, batteries. Help me out here. What?
In regards to what part of the car?
They're trying to make the new cars and they don't use fuel.
EV.
Thank you. I just blanked on that. With EV for a little bit, I thought, General Motors, Ford, they have to build completely new ways to do this. They could put this system in place, but it seems they didn't. So they haven't been super successful with them. And so that's kind of, you can take from the book also a theory just of competitiveness in that sense, that if you don't have a flexible system for producing, then it's going to be hard to innovate if you're too rigid. And you can be very successful for a while, but industries never are stagnant. They're always changing. And as it changes, if you're rigid in the way you produce things, you'll eventually fall off and you won't be the one at the front. And you have to be flexible and able to innovate so that you can stay in front of the changes.
Well, I find it funny that I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because I find it funny that the big three were so resistant about the EV change, right? They actually put up all kinds of roadblocks for somebody to
Mm-hmm.
come in and play that game. But Elon, number one, has the tenacity, the skill set, the resources to overcome all that, and he was able to do so. And now they're jumping on the bandwagon. So, um, number one, looking at the bailout, I don't like bailouts. I don't
Yeah.
like rewarding failure. I think they made a lot of decisions that were poor, and you either take a loan out and repay it back. But for us as taxpayers to bail you out for making a lot of mistakes, and then obviously all that money making a lot of bad people wealthy, not a big fan of it. However, yeah, there's a lot of great people's jobs that were saved. So, you can kind of balance it there. I'm looking at Elon though, and he's changing the game. I can't imagine where we're going to be 10, 15 years from now. I think there's a major trend that Tesla is selling way more than the average big three company. So, what are you seeing on the front of EV with Tesla and what he's doing and how it's going to impact the industry in America?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine as part of those changes we were talking about with the new generation, I think EV will be a big part of that. And so you can kind of see the trends now, but it hasn't taken hold. And I think people are probably underestimating the extent to which I could see Tesla leapfrogging in about 15 years as EV really takes hold of the dominant form.
Yep.
As people aren't buying as many cars, but they're being used for Ubers and whatnot. That the big three aren't going to have the ability to compete. They've tried and they seemingly can't. And Tesla is doing a good job. And so it's one thing when this is still a very tertiary, people. It's not the dominant way of buying cars. You can kind of dominate the industry, but not dominate the industry. But once it becomes a primary thing, when everybody's buying EV, I think you'll see a major change in the industry. And then it's a question of, will Tesla leapfrog to number one? Will, Toyota be able to compete? What will happen with that?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that one of the things about Tesla is that it is flexible and very innovative. And my
What I
understanding, I'm not a super expert in how they produce, but my understanding is there are features that mimic that kind of flexible production that allows them to be innovative. So I would assume they'll be able to stay on the cutting edge of things.
Personally, I don't have an EV car. I don't see myself buying one. I'm not a big fan of it because I love having that freedom. I don't want to be dependent on it. However, I see a lot of other people falling in love with this because, oh, I just charge it up every night and it's beautiful. They don't care about longevity. Every 5 years, they get a new car. What I envision the future to look like is very much like in Back to the Future 2. However, it's just going to be pretty much people staying within 15, 20 minutes of their home, right? You don't really need to go too far. The wealthy will have something else that can go all over and they can travel wherever, whenever. So that's the way I see it. Do you see anything coming down the pike that's alarming or, scary or exciting when it comes to this industry? Because I think that some people are going to get hurt by it and they're going to be limited to stay right where they're at. And then others are going to say, I don't care what gas prices are. I'm going to have a gas powered car. And that's how I get around. And you know what? It's going to be the haves and have nots, basically. What do you think?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's generally the story of things, right? In every system, you end up with haves and have-nots, so that
Yep.
will continue to be the story. I think there's a question of how are the changes, kind of what's the cause of the changes, and how are they managed. So if the changes are pushed from the top down, oftentimes there's unintended consequences because people are fallible. And so when you have experts creating the change, they can do it for really good reasons and think they have a handle, but history shows that we don't always have a handle, and it's not easily self-correcting. So I could see negatives if it's top down. Now, if it's kind of a bottom-up change, it's market-driven. The market has self-correcting mechanisms, so it's also fallible, but people quickly change. And talking about bailouts, I completely understand the political reason for the bailout. It's a terrible thing to have hundreds of thousands of people lose their job at a time when we were already suffering. But it does cause a problem in that it rewards failure. It also, if you imagine GM and Ford collapsing, there's still a demand for cars. Somebody can enter the market
Yes.
and meet that demand in a way that makes sense. By bailing them out, you limit people's ability to enter the market because you keep these kind of oligarchic corporations dominating. So, you know, in the short term, top-down things can seem very good, but oftentimes long term there's consequences, and it doesn't mean that the government has no role in things, but you have to be very careful about when it is, right? It's when the market can't function that you want to do that. When the market can, it's usually not a great thing. And so, you know, the market doesn't always function. There's times when you know, it's not easy to enter markets for various reasons. You don't have all the information. You know, those are times when it's good to put things in place, or you just need to act quickly. You know, disasters, things like that. But so if people are kind of limited to their immediate area because it's a top-down thing about environmental things, then I could conceive of there being many unintended consequences that the have-nots suffer. You know, the haves usually have an ability to make their way through unintended consequences in an all right way. And that wouldn't be great. That would be scary. If on the other hand, this is a cultural change and it's demand driven, then I think we'll probably figure out a way that people will be mostly happy with it.
Mm. Yeah, I do not like rewarding failure. And you're right about how when the government gets involved, it's a slippery slope. And I love capitalism. That bailout was not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. And, you know, you do that enough times, it's not a free market anymore. So I'm scared when people do that. Uh, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from the automobile industry? My only assumption is that for everybody out there watching or listening to this right now or on Spotify, you know, you have a business and you can learn a lot from what happened here, what not to do. And I think that you need to implement technology as fast as it comes in. You do not try to run from AI, you use it to your advantage. I also say stay away from regulations and unions, right? You want to be free to nimble, free to pivot. And I would say to never get comfortable. That's my big takeaway is every time you get comfortable, you should get scared to implement something new and to enter the unknown world again. That's what I get from it. What else can we learn?
Yeah, I think the importance of kind of thinking long term and not getting too focused on the short term. I think it's easy to focus on the short term, but we see a short term focus by the auto companies. They were as good as can be, and then it all collapsed very quickly. Um, and part of that is I don't think they saw coming the fact that they weren't innovating anymore and what would happen if a competitor came in that was. They just imagined time stopped. They were dominant. They'd all kind of in some ways collude with each other. Okay, none of us are going to implement innovations. We'll all just spread it out and undermine workers. And so you have to think long term. I think you have to. It's probably you need to let the market work. That when you try to collude and create little oligarchies, oftentimes the market will get you. And I think you learn that the most beneficial setup for everybody is one where workers and management are in partnership with each other. Even if there is a union, if you can work with them. So I mean, you know, one way of viewing a union, and this often happens, is it is combative. It's the workers collectively against you, and that's a problem. But if it's the workers collectively, it's hard to talk to every worker. If it's an ability to partnership with the workers collectively and work out a thing that's best for the industry and for the business, I think that's the best outcome. You know, that was one of my big lessons in looking both at the old auto industry and then the Japanese one. You know, the old auto industry, Henry Ford invented the $5 day. The auto industry was paying better than most other industries. It wasn't an anti-worker industry, and it wasn't because Henry Ford was really nice and was a communist that loved workers, right? It was because he discovered that when the workers were really underpaid, they had no attachment to the business, and you couldn't innovate. You couldn't trust them. They left. They didn't show up. They thought, who cares? This isn't a very good job. I can get another bad job easily. And he wanted the workers to buy in. He wanted them to be bought into the company, attached to the company. And so the $5 day came, but so did so did things like they had a loan service GM did that would help their workers buy houses. And this is the company town, which often is viewed as very negative. And there were negative aspects, of course, but there was a lot of positive to it. They had health insurance for their workers. They had company baseball teams. They had, you know, rec things that the workers their lives were tied to the company in a positive way. And that went away when the depression hit because they couldn't afford it. And that was the start of kind of losing trust. But they also had this kind of set up where they trusted each other that anytime you were innovating, everyone was going to have to sacrifice. So, they would often shut the line down and stop producing cars, and they would lay off half the workers. But when the innovation worked and they went back to market and made a bunch of money, the workers they laid off, they'd hire them back at higher wages. And so over time, they kind of had this, they created this, or what I call a moral economy, that was, we're in it together, right? We'll sacrifice together and we share the reward. And that is really a great setup for innovating and for a successful business. When your workers feel like, I'm in it with you, and that when we need to, when times are tough, we will sacrifice with you, but we know when you make it, you're going to reward us too. One of the things out of the Great Depression, like, that broke that, was that when they started making money again, they didn't hire the workers they laid off. They hired new workers at entry wages so they could save money. And so for the workers, that was a signal of, oh, it's broken. We sacrificed when things collapsed, just like the company, but now you're making money, you didn't give it back to us. And that kind of started the union thing, that started the strike. And so then you fast forward and you look at Japan, and it's that similar thing. There is this trust that we are willing to sacrifice for the company because we know we'll share in the reward. And Toyota and the Japanese companies have managed to mostly keep that. They haven't had big strikes and big problems. They've been forward thinking on that. So oftentimes they'll have benefits that seem cutting edge, and they're not forced by unions. And it's because they see that if we offer these benefits, the workers buy into the company, and we can actually implement these innovations. Because part of innovating, actually, you need to know what the workers think. They're the ones on the ground doing it, right? And so a lot of, as I went through some of the big innovations in the auto industry, you'd see that designers would meet with rank and file workers and talk about, here's the idea. And the workers would say, no, that's not going to work because of this. And they would work through the innovation so that it worked. And so you kind of need everybody in it together. And that would be one of my big lessons, is a capitalism that is crony capitalism, that is pits, is anti-worker. That's not as useful as a business that sees that we're in a partnership with the workers, that they need us, I need you, and we work together. That's better for everybody.
Oh, it's a few great takeaways, guys. With the Henry Ford story, that he wanted buy-in, right? So he had to pay more to make sure that there was buy-in, to show, hey, you're a part of this. That is a lesson that will never die. And that's huge. And so if the person can envision themselves at this company for 5, 10, 15 years, they can see themselves there, they're going to work harder for it, because they have the vision in their mind, and they're working towards something. And I guess if you reward them whenever times are good, right? Hey, if you have a big windfall, you need to compensate your team. People notice that, and there's more loyalty. And that seems like it's what he did. Wow.
Yeah.
It's great. Outside of your own book, is there one that you recommend to our audience that maybe got you to fall in love with the automobile industry, or just business in general, or even writing? In fact, you wrote a book on this, and you had this well thought out and put it down on a piece of paper and had the world read it. And there's a great, people are buying into this book on Amazon. What was one book that maybe stands out in your life as like a defining moment?
That's a really good question. It's a hard question. So as you know, a professor, this is what we do. So there's so many things that I read. And I think for me, there's classic works. The idea that I could share my ideas and influence people, that they could learn something from them, was really great. I think a lot of the work that I do is actually, we talked about crony capitalism, is kind of on that I see the capitalism that we have here is very much characterized as that. It's not really free
There's a lot
market.
of that. Yeah.
And so I study a lot of that about elites and their ties. And so it's not really on the auto industry, but my favorite book on that I kind of go back to all the time, it's from the 80s. It's called The Inner Circle by Michael Useem. He is a business professor at Penn. It's fantastic. So he has all this quantitative data on the ties between kind of corporate boards and government agencies and whatnot. But then he goes and he interviews the corporate board members. And they're just they're so honest with him, and you learn so much. It's a kind of the thing that I aspire to in terms of a book. It's such a good study, and it's so interesting. You find out so much. And I think a lot of it still applies. Of course, 30 something years ago, 40 years ago now. So things have changed, but a lot hasn't changed. So I love that book, and that bled into this book. I think just trying to be really exhaustive in the study and think about alternative explanations and really try to explain through why things happen, not just say that they happen, but really work through. Looking at books like that inspire me to do that.
Yeah, just by doing a quick glance of your book, it's very well thought out, and you cite many sources. So, pretty incredible stuff, man. Is there a way for people to get in touch with you, a social media channel or a website? You're still teaching? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm still at Vanderbilt. So if you go to Vanderbilt Sociology, I have a page there. It has my CV, it has the email, and I'm not a big social media person, so, but I am available by email all the time. I have an office phone, and I love to interact with people, and so yeah, easy to get a hold of.
So, last question I have for you. Okay, you're a car guy. You are an historian, it sounds like, more so than anything else. What kind of car you got? What's your favorite one?
I haven't. So I had a Toyota before, which shouldn't be surprising.
No
But
wonder. No
I have a
wonder
Subaru,
you're such a fan of them. Okay.
and I have a Subaru now, and I'm a big fan of. I have a Subaru Outback now, and I actually really love it.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. Subarus are good brands, man. They go forever too. Toyotas too. Every
Yeah,
Toyota that I know goes couple 100,000 miles. So you got good taste. Anyways, guys, the book is called Wrecked and it's on Amazon and it came out in 2019. How the American automobile industry destroyed its capacity to compete. Josh Murray and Michael Schwartz is the co-author. Look it up. Obviously, fascinating stuff, and it really details what to do, what not to do when it comes to running your business. You could take a lot from this and apply it to any industry. So it's an honor to talk with you, sir. Thank you so much for being here.
thank you so much for having me. Honor's all mine.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life. Right on.